In our previous lecture, we examined the darkening storm clouds over Europe, over much of the world, in the course of the troubled decade of the 1930s. In today's lecture, we'll examine one very prominent feature of that trajectory, the rise of the disturbing movement of Nazism in Germany. In this lecture, we'll be examining the origins, the ideological beliefs, and the rise to power of the Nazi movement in Germany. As we'll see, many of the origins for these phenomena lay even further back than the 1930s, troubled as they were, in the legacy of the First World War. We will discuss, in particular, the Nazi worldview and its promises for a fundamental reordering of German society along racial lines after coming to power in 1933, their fusing of terror with modernizing programs for superhighways, superweapons, and supermen, and the promise of a German utopia. We turn first of all to the question of the origins of Nazism. And one particular point that we want to underline is just how much these origins owed to the effects of that first great war, World War I. Time and again, we see that the features of the Nazi movement, its ideology, tie back to roots in the First World War. The impact of that war on culture, on politics, on society, truly laid the groundwork for the emergence of the Nazi movement in Germany and crucially informed its ideology. Some historians have traced back the energies, the mobilization of the masses that the Nazis sought to those days at the start of the First World War, the so-called August Madness, in which, in a moment of ecstasy, which was supposed to overcome the earlier divisions in society, Germans had allegedly felt lifted up into a sense of national unity and national purpose. That analyst, whom we have discussed already in earlier lectures of the dynamics of crowds and of masses, Elias Canetti, had already written in his book Crowds of Power that in some sense the National Socialist movement began not merely in 1919 with the formal founding of the party that became the Nazi Party, but began in fact in those August days of 1914. He argued that Hitler and the Nazis would seek to ever afterwards reclaim or recreate by artifice that emotion that Germans had supposedly felt in 1914. It was following upon such a sense of national mobilization that defeat had hit Germany particularly hard in 1918. Many ordinary Germans were left embittered, unable to accept the fact of failure, and historians of Germany are emphasizing ever more today that it was not the harshness of the post-war settlement that was crucial in setting Germany upon its troubled path in the years after 1918, but rather the fundamental inability of ordinary Germans to accept defeat. This had crucial consequences. Faith in the democratic Weimar Republic, as it was called after the town of Weimar in which the constitution of this new democracy was written, was crucially undermined by those things that it was associated with in the minds of Germans. Association with German defeat, what Germans denounced as the Versailles Treaty, universally condemned in German society, and a legacy of economic hardship carrying over from the dislocations of the First World War. In spite of a period of stability from 1924 to 1929, German democracy still remained fragile. German nationalists had an explanation for what they saw as the humiliation of their nation. They propagated what came to be called the stab-in-the-back legend, which claimed that German armies had in fact not been defeated on the battlefield, but that Germany's war effort had been betrayed by forces on the home front, by, in a sort of scapegoating of minorities in German society, it was claimed, German Democrats, German Socialists, and in particular, a religious minority, German Jews. In the post-war turmoil in Germany, a small new party that called itself the German Workers' Party, its acronym was the DAP, was established in turmoil-filled Munich in the south in January of 1919 by nationalists who had earlier been active in the German war effort, had earlier been active in the Fatherland Party, established to bolster German morale in the last stages of the World War. And this small group was but one among hundreds such radical small groups in German society. But it was destined for a fate different than those of these small parties that tended to fade with time. And this in part was due to chance. In September of 1919, one meeting of this German Workers' Party was visited by a then unknown soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler. He had been charged by the German army as part of its intelligence gathering operations to collect information on such small political gatherings. Hitler, who had attended this meeting, soon became a member. I'm pretty sure that the observers were not supposed to do this, and soon had a meteoric rise within the party. By 1921, he was the party's chairman, and at his urging, the party renamed itself, taking on the name National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was known by its full acronym as the NSDAP, or by short, as the Nazi Party. That very name was significant. The words national and German tended to appeal to nationalist conservatives, while the words socialist and worker tended to appeal to those on the left side of the spectrum. What this very name announced was a crucial attribute of this young radical movement, the attempt to reach out to a broad constituency in German society, promising something for everyone. Hitler was in the process of remaking this party in his own image. The very figure of Hitler would be crucial in this context. Hitler presented himself and was presented in the propaganda of the young Nazi Party as the unknown soldier who had emerged from the trenches of the Great War, transformed by that experience, carrying a message of renewed greatness to a humiliated nation. The obscure man, Hitler, presented himself as the embodiment of all those million unknown trench soldiers who had experienced the fighting on the Western Front. Hitler's own conception of his role changed over time. He had at first seen himself as, he put it, a drummer, summoning a new political coalition of a group of forces opposed with democracy in Germany to do away with the democratic experiment. But over time, he would come to see himself not simply as a summoner of energies, but as the prime leader himself. Due to his skills in oratory, as well as organization and the hard work of propaganda, Hitler himself became ever more crucial to the fortunes of the Nazi movement, and indeed very often among ordinary Germans, as it gained prominence, it was often called the Hitler movement. Hitler's followers began to call him by a nearly messianic title, calling him the Führer, the leader, the man of destiny. In urban legend, Hitler's oratorical skills were ascribed to his experiences in the First World War. Supposedly, having been gassed in the trenches of that conflict, had done something to his vocal cords, had changed the nature of his voice, had given it a hypnotic quality. Well, this was urban legend, this was speculation, this was the sort of supernatural myth that would surround the figure of Hitler and expectations vested in him. What was indisputable and was true was that Hitler clearly knew his audience. He was able to speak to their deepest fears and deepest desires. He himself would explain that he saw himself as channeling his audience's innermost feelings, innermost convictions. He was careful to take the pulse of a crowd and to tell that crowd what it wanted. This was the reality of his oratorical skills. Another crucial element in the Nazis' rise to power was also the calculated use of terror. And in particular, Nazi stormtroopers called the SA were the enforcers of this terror on the streets of German towns and cities. Nazi organization and ritual within the party were permeated with the influences of that great experience of the First World War. And this was most clearly the case when we examine the stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilung, or the SA as it was called. They were organized in 1921 as the political arm of the party. They saw themselves as political soldiers. They were essentially, however, thugs who were dressed in brown-shirted uniforms. They drew their inspiration from Mussolini's Italian fascist black shirt movement, and indeed it was clear that they imitated this effective model. It was joked at the time that indeed Hitler had sought black shirts for his stormtroopers, but that the stores had been out of them at that time. There had been a sale on brown shirts, hence the uniforms. It was joked at the time that in one characteristic of the party after another, in its ritual and symbols, one could very clearly see the tremendous debt that Hitler, as a would-be dictator, owed to Mussolini and his Italian fascists, from the Roman salute to the imitation of the shirts for the thuggish stormtroopers. It was joked that Hitler could visit Italy in the future, and he would then have to hail his earlier patron, or the man he'd modeled himself on, Mussolini, with the words, "Hail Imperator," hail to the emperor. The joke then continued that Mussolini would have to answer, "Hail Imitator," hail you imitator of Mussolini's own tactics. The stormtroopers of the SA grew out of a wider thuggish milieu in the troubled German society. More than 1 million men had belonged to the paramilitary organizations of the Freikorps that had risen in defeated Germany in 1919 to 1920, and many such men were sluiced into the stormtroopers' ranks. The stormtroopers' leadership prided itself on a gangster style, on their toughness, indeed on their brutal violence. A man who excelled at this, a former Freikorps captain, Ernst Röhm, was the leader of the SA. Hitler now pursued what he thought was a clear and determined plan for power, and it was to be an imitation of Mussolini's own tactics that had been successful in Italy. He aimed to imitate Mussolini's March on Rome in an incident that has come to be called by the faintly ridiculous name of the Beer Hall Putsch. Imitating Mussolini's determined March on Rome, Hitler aimed to start a march on Berlin on November 8th, 1923. Well, this was something out of a comic opera. The stormtroopers didn't even make it out of downtown Munich on their march on Berlin, as the police fired on them and the marchers scattered. This revolt ended in failure, but what followed was key in the rise of Hitler. At the treason trial, Hitler, in part due to sympathetic judges, exploited this opportunity to win a media victory, turning the tables on the German democracy that was putting him on trial. His name now gained national resonance, and it was crucial in relaunching the party in 1925 when he was released from his ludicrously short term in prison. We now turn to examine the Nazi ideology which the Nazis championed. At its ideological core were the ideas of racism and anti-Semitism. Hitler had a brutal social Darwinist worldview that looked out into the world and saw a reality of constant struggle, and in fact, constant racial war, pitting peoples against peoples, races against races, in a constant struggle for survival, a struggle in part for Lebensraum, or living space, in which a people could expand and grow. The applications, thus, for the Nazis were obvious. One needed to consciously seek racial strategies, to embrace natural conflict that they understood as the key to history in order to win triumph for the German people. The Nazis posited the existence of a superior race which they aimed to recreate. This was the superior Aryan race. The Aryans, of which the Germans were supposed to be the finest surviving exemplars, though by no means pure themselves, were supposedly, in the stereotypes that the Nazis championed, blonde, tall, honest, good, embodying all that was creative and healthy, and of necessity they were juxtaposed with a demonic stereotype of the exact opposite. Those were the Jews, depicted by the Nazis as parasites, incapable of creating culture on their own, eternally contaminating influences upon other peoples, and by definition, the eternal enemies of all that the Aryan race for the Nazis stood for. The Germans were supposedly the purest remnants of the original Aryans and would now have to be recreated. The Nazis promised the creation within Germany of a true racial unity. The charged term that they used for this idea was the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. This was to be a racial utopia, of rough egalitarianism among those who belong to this racial unity. This racial utopia would be achieved by the purification and consolidation of the German people within, the elimination of the Jewish minority, and then aggressive expansion abroad. Other elements of the Nazi ideology included opposition. Opposition to democracy, which was considered weak and individualistic. Opposition to Marxism, though the Nazis claimed to represent a truer German socialism, not based in materialism. Opposition to pacifism, to individualism, which was considered self-serving. Opposition to capitalism. Opposition to what was called a soulless rationality, and against the intellectual life. Influenced by the model of the mobilization of the masses of World War I, the Nazis valued a strong state standing above individuals, military mobilization, and war, which they considered the guarantee of the health of the nation. How was it that the Nazis championing this extreme ideology could come to power? Well, in part, it was due to the hard work of organization as they sought to come to power using democracy to destroy democracy. While in prison until 1925, Hitler had dictated a manifesto, which he called Mein Kampf, which might be translated as my struggle or my battle, my war. In it, in this otherwise unreadable book, full of bad prose and ludicrous ideas, Hitler did announce, in a prophetic way, his route to power. And this was summed up as the legal route to power, using the ballot box to come to power legally and then to destroy German democracy, to enter parliament, to destroy it. Hitler outlined his plans to create a mass party, and in the original sections of this book, he discussed remarkably innovative ideas on the use of manipulative propaganda to win the confidence of the masses. The Nazis, motivated by their fanatical hatred of the system, outdid other parties in organization and intensive activity. In some cases, they borrowed models from their ideological enemies, the communists, as when they set up a nationwide party network in imitation of the Communist Party cells permeating other countries. But the Nazis were at first disappointed by the results of their attempts to propagandize and mobilize Germany. They only gained less than 3% of the vote in the 1928 parliamentary elections. The true opportunity would come with crisis, the crisis of the Great Depression. From 1929 on, the Great Depression, destroying developed industrial economies, hitting the United States and Germany especially hard, sped the Nazis' way to power in Germany. Weimar democracy, as historians have pointed out, was already off in a bad way, perhaps even moribund, before the Nazis come to power in 1933. From 1930 on, Parliament was hard put to pass effective legislation. In the 1930 election, the Nazis scored a breakthrough success, becoming the second largest party, a true mass movement within German society. In the July 1932 elections, they built on this success, becoming the largest party in Germany. And that dream of Hitler, of the legal route to power, seemed almost within their grasp. We want briefly to outline some of the remarkably innovative means of Nazi propaganda. These included, above all, mass meetings. Mass meetings that were supposed to be a vivid symbol of the gathering together of Germans into the people's community, or the Volksgemeinschaft. They generated excitement and an image of dynamism for the Nazi Party. In the year 1932, the Nazis organized up to 3,000 meetings every day nationwide, in the large German cities as well as small towns and villages. The Nazis used modern technology, including airplanes, to orchestrate their campaigns. They were also aided by another feature of the Nazi Party's self-image, and that was the image of the youthfulness of this movement. The youthfulness of Nazi Party members and activists was another crucial attribute in selling the Nazi movement to Germans at large. The average age of a new member of the Nazi Party in the course of the 1920s was 29 years, compared to the relatively older demographic of established German parties This was striking for its youthfulness. And again, the Nazis emphasized one symbol of their movement: coordinated marching of masses, of true believers, of stormtroopers that were intended to have an exhilarating effect. The Nazi movement anthem stressed the stormtroopers were on the march, Germany was on the march towards a Nazi future. The Nazis were also aided in their rise to power through the remarkable polarization of German politics. Within German politics, the Marxist parties of the left, the Social Democrats, and the German Communist Party, which might otherwise have cooperated to stop the rise of Nazism, were in fact bitter rivals. The Comintern, the Communist International Organization, following Stalin's orders, had directed the German Communist Party to denounce the Social Democrats as nothing better than social fascists. They argued that in the coming struggle, German communists were confident of being able to pick up the pieces after the collapse of German democracy, after the collapse of the Nazi movement, and after the collapse of the social democratic rivals. The communist slogan, which as we now know was self-deluding, was "After Hitler, us." The communists hoped to come to power. Thus, an opportunity was lost to forestall the Nazis' rise to prominence. By contrast, in this remarkably fragmented, polarized German political scene, the Nazis presented themselves in a remarkably self-serving way as the only party that reached out to the broad masses of German society, the only party that was a natural alternative to communism now that democracy had failed. Curiously indeed, while these parties were ideologically at loggerheads, a strange reciprocal antagonistic relationship emerged between the Nazis and the communists in this crisis. They both hoped to benefit from the collapse of German democracy. They both, in practice, cooperated to make the German parliament impossible. The Nazis were, moreover, very proud of opportunities to win followers from the communists, feeling that this was a true symbol of their promise of owning the future by winning over such former true believers. And the Nazis now would come to power. Ironically, in spite of Hitler's ambitions to come to power through the ballot box, the Nazis in fact entered government in January of 1933 through backroom intrigues, not through a clear-cut election victory. In the November 1932 elections, the Nazis were stunned and horrified to see their percentage of the vote dip, suggesting that at long last their growing support had peaked and now was on the decline. Nonetheless, in January 30th, 1933, Hitler became chancellor in coalition and in cooperation with conservative nationalists who had placed him in power but who planned to manipulate him. He would end by manipulating them. The Nazi worldview was now in power, and the Nazis would seek to Nazify German society through their policy called Gleichschaltung. Once in power, Hitler outflanked his conservative nationalist allies by securing control of the police forces, and then, after the mysterious Reichstag fire on February 27th, the passage of the so-called Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, sometimes called the Suicide Note of the German Parliament, which gave Hitler control of legal authority in Germany. This impression of legality would be very important in the Nazis' consolidation of power. In the following 6 months, the Nazis pursued their policy of Gleichschaltung, which might be translated as coordination or consolidation of control, to Nazify Germany. They purged the civil service, outlawed other political parties, shut down labor unions, and relentlessly terrorized political opponents. At the same time, they promised the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, was supposedly coming into being. A community of solidarity in which, it was said, the common good would come before the individual good, an appealing slogan to many Germans. The striving of the Nazis for total power was presented as a transcendence of earlier divisions. And in the August 1934 plebiscite, not an election, but a poll, as it were, of the German people, 85% of the voters approved the Nazi regime. Not in a free election, but nonetheless a measure, so the Nazis felt, of legitimacy given to their regime. At the same time, the Nazis made open use of terror in quelling resistance or challenges. In 1934, The SA, the stormtroopers, now consisted of 4 million men, a formidable force. They established concentration camps openly throughout Germany, not hidden. It was announced that their purpose was supposedly re-education or the protective custody of those who had opposed the Nazi regime. A model camp was established in March 1933 in Dachau, outside of Munich, which was later imitated widely throughout Germany, a model of terror. Now, in spite of their brutality, these concentration camps were not as yet places of mass murder as the death camps of World War II would be, but they certainly prefigured them in their coordinated, calculated use of violence. As this was going on, the Nazis announced that they were building the German future, rebuilding the country with vast public works projects, including the Autobahn superhighways that one can still see in Germany today. A promise was made to the German people that the Volkswagen, which one can also see today, the people's car, would allow the German people to enjoy a level of prosperity and a quality of life that they'd not known before. At the same time, however, rearmament began. In 1936, in imitation of Stalin's industrialization drives, the so-called four-year plan was announced to ready Germany for prosperity and greatness on the international scene. By 1939, the Nazi regime was boasting of full employment in Germany. And for ordinary Germans, this certainly made the Nazi regime popular. Society was on its way to being Nazified. Nazi propaganda urged an idealized utopia of a united folk, working and acting together. The images that celebrated this were the common images of shared meals of communal stew, not very appetizing perhaps today, the so-called Eintopf, or winter relief campaigns in which charity was organized by the state. To shape popular opinion, in March of 1933, the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda was established, led by Joseph Goebbels, a Rhinelander, one of the few highly educated members of the Nazi elite, and a propaganda mastermind. His talents were exemplified by his earlier listing off of 10 commandments for National Socialists, transmuting the religious impulse into a political religion. The regime subsidized, moreover, the production of a particular piece of physical equipment which was supposed to spread its message far and wide. This was the production of millions of so-called Volkssender, or people's radios, that were now proliferated throughout Germany in order to spread the message of the regime. Germany had at this point the highest rate of radio ownership in the world. In this modern measure of a society's advancement, 70% of households in Germany had access to these radios. For those who did not, thousands of loudspeaker pillars, as they were called, were set up in public places throughout Germany so that the booming voice of Hitler, the Führer, could be heard throughout the nation. Goebbels announced that the radio would mediate to the masses in this age of the masses. He announced that the Nazi Revolution wouldn't have been possible without the radio, and he aimed to use it for propaganda. The regime also energetically intervened in the family. Women's chief role was now to be breeders of new soldiers. Just as in the Soviet Union, medals were awarded to women who were producing large numbers of children. They were hailed for their contribution to the national cause. Special attention was also given to young people. They participated in the ritual burning of books to show the downgrading of traditional education. This was now replaced with the induction of boys into the Hitler Youth for military training, girls into the League of German Maidens to take them out of the family and instead to induct them into a Nazified society. Finally, there was the Nazis' perverse triumph in Nazifying the German language itself. A German Jewish philologist, a student of language by the name of Victor Klemperer, who survived the Nazi regime, was famed for his diaries, famed in our present day for his diaries which recorded his experiences. He also made a fascinating study of the Nazi perversion of the German language, which he felt was one of their keys to power. And he had the evidence of this ready to hand. He had been horrified to discover himself an opponent of the Nazi regime, sometimes falling into their rhetorical phrases. He observed with horror that the Nazis had turned terms which earlier had been negative, like fanaticism, into the very highest praise of all. The Nazis also set about a program of racial persecution to bring about their racial utopia. In their future, they promised racial solidarity, which was defined not simply by being German, but also defined against others, against those who were labeled outsiders, German Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, homosexuals, and other minorities. The Nazi state would attack these groups with growing radicalism. And the man who steered these policies, Adolf Hitler, is the man we'll discuss in our next lecture.